Chapter 3, Part 2 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 3, The Sign of the Shadow. "And they will be there always," exclaimed Maître Valandier. Unless Citizen Broquet, who no doubt smelt a rat, succeeded in ferreting them out. But this is an unlikely supposition, for Citizen Broquet died in extreme poverty. So then everybody began to hunt. The children of Pauline, the sister, hastened from Geneva. It was discovered that Charles had been secretly married and that he had sons. All these heirs set to work. But Charles himself? Charles lived in the most absolute retirement. He did not leave his room. Never? Well, that is the most extraordinary, the most astounding part of the story. Once a year, Charles d'Ernemont, impelled by a sort of subconscious willpower, came downstairs, took the exact road which his father had taken, walked across the garden and sat down either on the steps of the rotunda, which you see here in the picture, or on the curb of the well. At 27 minutes past 5, he rose and went indoors again, and until his death, which occurred in 1820, he never once failed to perform this incomprehensible pilgrimage. Well, the day on which this happened was invariably the 15th of April, the anniversary of the arrest. Maître Valandier was no longer smiling, and himself seemed impressed by the amazing story which he was telling us. "And since Charles's death?" asked Lupin, after a moment's reflection. "Since that time," replied the lawyer, with a certain solemnity of manner, "for nearly 100 years, the heirs of Charles and Pauline d'Ernemont have kept up the pilgrimage of the 15th of April. During the first few years, they made the most thorough excavations. Every inch of the garden was searched, every clod of ground dug up. All this is now over. They take hardly any pains. All they do is, from time to time, for no particular reason, to turn over a stone or explore the well. For the most part, they are content to sit down on the steps of the rotunda, like the poor madman, and like him they wait. And that, you see, is the sad part of their destiny. In those 100 years, all these people who have succeeded one another, from father to son, have lost, what shall I say, the energy of life. They have no courage left, no initiative. They wait for the 15th of April, and when the 15th of April comes, they wait for a miracle to take place. Poverty has ended by overtaking every one of them. My predecessors and I have sold first the house, in order to build another which yields a better rent, followed by bits of the garden and further bits. But as to that corner over there," pointing to the picture, "they would rather die than sell it. On this they are all agreed. Louise d'Ernemont, who is the direct heiress of Pauline, as well as the beggars, the workman, the footman, the circus rider, and so on, who represent the unfortunate Charles." There was a fresh pause, and Lupin asked, "What is your own opinion, Maître Valandier?" "My private opinion is that there's nothing in it. What credit can we give to the statements of an old servant enfeebled by age? What importance can we attach to the crotchets of a madman? Besides, if the farmer general had realized his fortune, don't you think that that fortune would have been found? One could manage to hide a paper, a document, in a confined space like that, but not treasures. Still, the pictures... Yes, of course. But after all, are they a sufficient proof?" Lupin bent over the copy which the solicitor had taken from the cupboard, and after examining it at length said, "You spoke of 3 pictures." "Yes, the one which you see was handed to my predecessor by the heirs of Charles. Louise d'Ernemont possesses another. As for the third, no one knows what became of it." Lupin looked at me and continued, "And do they all bear the same date?" "Yes, the date inscribed by Charles d'Ernemont when he had them framed, not long before his death. The same date, that is to say, the 15th of April, year 2, according to the revolutionary calendar, as the arrest took place in April, 1794. "Oh, yes, of course," said Lupin. "The figure 2 means..." He thought for a few moments and resumed. "One more question, if I may. Did no one ever come forward to solve the problem?" Maître Valandier threw up his arms. "Good gracious me!" he cried. "Why, it was the plague of the office. One of my predecessors, Maître Turban, was summoned to Passy no fewer than 18 times, between 1820 and 1843, by the groups of heirs, whom fortune-tellers, clairvoyants, visionaries, impostors of all sorts had promised that they would discover the farmer general's treasures. At last we laid down a rule. Any outsider applying to institute a search was to begin by depositing a certain sum. What sum? 1,000 francs. And did this have the effect of frightening them off? No. 4 years ago, an Hungarian hypnotist tried the experiment and made me waste a whole day. After that, we fixed the deposit at 5,000 francs. In case of success, a third of the treasure goes to the finder. In case of failure, the deposit is forfeited to the heirs. Since then, I have been left in peace. Here are your 5,000 francs. The lawyer gave a start. Eh? What do you say? I say, repeated Lupin, taking 5 banknotes from his pocket and calmly spreading them on the table, I say that here is the deposit of 5,000 francs. Please give me a receipt and invite all the d'Ernemont heirs to meet me at Passy on the 15th of April next year. The notary could not believe his senses. I myself, although Lupin had accustomed me to these surprises, was utterly taken aback. Are you serious? Asked Maître Valandier. Perfectly serious. But, you know, I told you my opinion. All these improbable stories rest upon no evidence of any kind. I don't agree with you, said Lupin. The notary gave him the look which we give to a person who is not quite right in his head. Then, accepting the situation, he took his pen and drew up a contract on stamped paper, acknowledging the payment of the deposit by Captain Jeanniot and promising him a third of such moneys as he should discover. If you change your mind, he added, you might let me know a week before the time comes. I shall not inform the d'Ernemont family until the last moment, so as not to give those poor people too long a spell of hope. You can inform them this very day, Maître Valandier. It will make them spend a happier year. We said good-bye. Outside in the street, I cried, So you've hit upon something? I? Replied Lupin. Not a bit of it, and that's just what amuses me. But they have been searching for 100 years. It is not so much a matter of searching as of thinking. Now I have 365 days to think in. It is a great deal more than I want, and I am afraid that I shall forget all about the business, interesting though it may be. Oblige me by reminding me, will you? I reminded him of it several times during the following months, though he never seemed to attach much importance to the matter. Then came a long period during which I had no opportunity of seeing him. It was the period, as I afterward learnt, of his visit to Armenia and of the terrible struggle on which he embarked against Abdul the Damned, a struggle which ended in the tyrant's downfall. I used to write to him, however, at the address which he gave me, and I was thus able to send him certain particulars which I had succeeded in gathering here and there about my neighbour Louise d'Ernemont, such as the love which she had conceived, a few years earlier, for a very rich young man, who still loved her, but who had been compelled by his family to throw her over, the young widow's despair, and the plucky life which she led with her little daughter. Lupin replied to none of my letters. I did not know whether they reached him, and meantime the date was drawing near, and I could not help wondering whether his numerous undertakings would not prevent him from keeping the appointment which he himself had fixed. As a matter of fact, the morning of the 15th of April arrived, and Lupin was not with me by the time I had finished lunch. It was 12:15. I left my flat and took a cab to Passy. I had no sooner entered the lane than I saw the workmen's 4 brats standing outside the door in the wall. Maître Valandier, informed by them of my arrival, hastened in my direction. "Well," he cried, "where's Captain Jeanniot?" "Hasn't he come?" "No, and I can assure you that everybody is very impatient to see him." The different groups began to crowd round the lawyer, and I noticed that all those faces which I recognized had thrown off the gloomy and despondent expression which they wore a year ago. "They are full of hope," said Maître Valandier, "and it is my fault. But what could I do? Your friend made such an impression upon me that I spoke to these good people with a confidence which I cannot say I feel. However, he seems a queer sort of fellow, this Captain Jeanniot of yours." He asked me many questions, and I gave him a number of more or less fanciful details about the captain, to which the heirs listened, nodding their heads in appreciation of my remarks. "Of course the truth was bound to be discovered sooner or later," said the fat gentleman, in a tone of conviction. The infantry corporal, dazzled by the captain's rank, did not entertain a doubt in his mind. The lady with the little dog wanted to know if Captain Jeanniot was young. But Louise d'Ernemont said, "And suppose he does not come?" "We shall still have the 5,000 francs to divide," said the beggarman. For all that, Louise d'Ernemont's words had damped their enthusiasm. Their faces began to look sullen, and I felt an atmosphere as of anguish weighing upon us. At 1:30, the 2 lean sisters felt faint and sat down. Then the fat gentleman in the soiled suit suddenly rounded on the notary. "It's you, Maître Valandier, who are to blame. You ought to have brought the captain here by main force. He's a humbug, that's quite clear." He gave me a savage look, and the footman, in his turn, flung muttered curses at me. I confess that their reproaches seemed to me well-founded, and that Lupin's absence annoyed me greatly. "He won't come now," I whispered to the lawyer. And I was thinking of beating a retreat when the eldest of the brats appeared at the door, yelling, "There's someone coming! A motorcycle!" A motor was throbbing on the other side of the wall. A man on a motor bicycle came tearing down the lane at the risk of breaking his neck. Suddenly he put on his brakes outside the door and sprang from his machine. Under the layer of dust which covered him from head to foot, we could see that his navy blue reefer suit, his carefully creased trousers, his black felt hat and patent leather boots were not the clothes in which a man usually goes cycling. "But that's not Captain Jeanniot!" shouted the notary, who failed to recognize him. "Yes, it is," said Lupin, shaking hands with us. "I'm Captain Jeanniot, right enough, only I've shaved off my moustache. Besides, Maître Valandier, here's your receipt." He caught one of the workman's children by the arm and said, "Run to the cab rank and fetch a taxi to the corner of the Rue Renoir. Look sharp. I have an urgent appointment to keep at 2:00, or 1:15 at the latest." There was a murmur of protest. Captain Jeanniot took out his watch. "Well, it's only 12 minutes to 2. I have a good quarter of an hour before me. But by jingo, how tired I feel, and how hungry into the bargain." The corporal thrust his ammunition bread into Lupin's hand, and he munched away at it as he sat down and said, "You must forgive me. I was in the Marseille Express, which left the rails between Dijon and La Roche. There were 12 people killed, and any number injured, whom I had to help. Then I found this motorcycle in the luggage van. Maître Valandier, you must be good enough to restore it to the owner. You will find the label fastened to the handlebar. Ah, you're back, my boy. Is the taxi there, at the corner of the Rue Renoir? Capital." He looked at his watch again. Hullo, no time to lose. I stared at him with eager curiosity. But how great must the excitement of the d'Ernemont heirs have been! True, they had not the same faith in Captain Jeanniot that I had in Lupin. Nevertheless, their faces were pale and drawn. Captain Jeanniot turned slowly to the left and walked up to the sundial. The pedestal represented the figure of a man with a powerful torso, who bore on his shoulders a marble slab, the surface of which had been so much worn by time that we could hardly distinguish the engraved lines that marked the hours. Above the slab, a Cupid, with outspread wings, held an arrow that served as an omen. The captain stood leaning forward for a minute, with attentive eyes. Then he said, "Somebody lend me a knife, please." A clock in the neighbourhood struck 2. At that exact moment, the shadow of the arrow was thrown upon the sunlit dial, along the line of a crack in the marble, which divided the slab very nearly in half. The captain took the knife handed to him, and with the point, very gently, he began to scratch the mixture of earth and moss that filled the narrow cleft. Almost immediately, at a couple of inches from the edge, he stopped, as though his knife had encountered an obstacle, inserted his thumb and forefinger, and withdrew a small object which he rubbed between the palms of his hand and gave to the lawyer. "Here, Maître Valandier, something to go on with." It was an enormous diamond, the size of a hazelnut and beautifully cut. The captain resumed his work. The next moment, a fresh stop. A second diamond, magnificent and brilliant as the first, appeared in sight. And then came a third and a fourth. In a minute's time, following the crack from one edge to the other, and certainly without digging deeper than half an inch, the captain had taken out 18 diamonds of the same size. During this minute there was not a cry, not a movement around the sundial. The air seemed paralysed with a sort of stupor. Then the fat gentleman muttered, "Jiminy!" And the corporal moaned, "Oh, Captain! Oh, Captain!" The two sisters fell in a dead faint. The lady with the little dog dropped on her knees and prayed, while the footman, staggering like a drunken man, held his head in his two hands, and Louise d'Ernemont wept. When calm was restored and all became eager to thank Captain Jeanniot, they saw that he was gone. Some years passed before I had an opportunity of talking to Lupin about this business. He was in a confidential vein and answered, "The business of the 18 diamonds? By Jove, when I think that 3 or 4 generations of my fellow men had been hunting for the solution, and the 18 diamonds were there all the time, under a little mud and dust." "But how did you guess?" "I did not guess. I reflected. I doubt if I need even have reflected. I was struck from the beginning by the fact that the whole circumstance was governed by one primary question: the question of time. When Charles d'Ernemont was still in possession of his wits, he wrote a date upon the 3 pictures. Later, in the gloom in which he was struggling, a faint glimmer of intelligence led him every year to the centre of the old garden, and the same faint glimmer led him away from it every year at the same moment, that is to say, at 27 minutes past 5. Something must have acted on the disordered machinery of his brain in this way. What was the superior force that controlled the poor madman's movements? Obviously, the instinctive notion of time represented by the sundial in the farmer general's pictures. It was the annual revolution of the earth around the sun that brought Charles d'Ernemont back to the garden at a fixed date. And it was the earth's daily revolution upon its own axis that took him from it at a fixed hour, that is to say, at the hour most likely when the sun, concealed by objects different from those of today, ceased to light the Passy garden. Now of all this the sundial was the symbol, and that is why I at once knew where to look. But how did you settle the hour at which to begin looking? Simply by the pictures. A man living at that time, such as Charles d'Ernemont, would have written either 26 Germinal, year 2, or else 15 April, 1794, but not 15 April, year 2. I was astounded that no one had thought of that. Then the figure 2 stood for 2 o'clock. Evidently, and what must have happened was this. The farmer general began by turning his fortune into solid gold and silver money. Then, by way of additional precaution, with this gold and silver he bought 18 wonderful diamonds. When he was surprised by the arrival of the patrol, he fled into his garden. Which was the best place to hide the diamonds? Chance caused his eyes to light upon the sundial. It was 2 o'clock. The shadow of the arrow was then falling along the crack in the marble. He obeyed this sign of the shadow, rammed his 18 diamonds into the dust, and calmly went back and surrendered to the soldiers. But the shadow of the arrow coincides with the crack in the marble every day of the year, and not only on the 15th of April. You forget, my dear chap, that we are dealing with a lunatic, and that he remembered only this date of the 15th of April. Very well, but you, once you had solved the riddle, could easily have made your way into the enclosure and taken the diamonds. Quite true, and I should not have hesitated if I had had to do with people of another description, but I really felt sorry for those poor wretches, and then you know the sort of idiot that Lupin is. The idea of appearing suddenly as a benevolent genius and amazing his kind would be enough to make him commit any sort of folly. "Tch!" I cried. The folly was not so great as all that. 6 magnificent diamonds. How delighted the d'Ernemont heirs must have been to fulfil their part of the contract. Lupin looked at me and burst into uncontrollable laughter. "So you have been hurt? Oh, what a joke! The delight of the d'Ernemont heirs! Why, my dear fellow, on the next day that worthy Captain Jeanniot had so many mortal enemies. On the very next day the 2 lean sisters and the fat gentleman organized an opposition. A contract, not worth the paper it was written on, because, as could easily be proved, there was no such person as Captain Jeanniot. Where did that adventurer spring from? Just let him sue them, and they'd soon show him what was what." "Louise d'Ernemont, too?" "No, Louise d'Ernemont protested against that piece of rascality. But what could she do against so many? Besides, now that she was rich, she got back her young man. I haven't heard of her since." So, my dear fellow, I was caught in a trap, with not a leg to stand on, and I had to compromise and accept 1 modest diamond as my share, the smallest and the least handsome of the lot. That comes of doing one's best to help people." And Lupin grumbled between his teeth. "Gratitude! All humbug! Where should we honest men be if we had not our conscience and the satisfaction of duty performed to reward us?" End of chapter 3. Chapter 4, Part 1 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 4. The Infernal Trap. When the race was over, a crowd of people, streaming toward the exit from the grandstand, pushed against Nicolas Dugrival. He brought his hand smartly to the inside pocket of his jacket. "What's the matter?" asked his wife. "I still feel nervous, with that money on me. I'm afraid of some nasty accident," she muttered. "And I can't understand you. How can you think of carrying such a sum about with you? Every farthing we possess. Lord knows it cost us trouble enough to earn." "Pooh," he said. "No one would guess that it is here in my pocket-book." "Yes, yes," she grumbled. "That young manservant whom we discharged last week knew all about it, didn't he, Gabrielle?" "Yes, aunt," said a youth standing beside her. Nicolas Dugrival, his wife, and his nephew Gabriel were well-known figures at the race meetings, where the regular frequenters saw them almost every day. Dugrival, a big, fat, red-faced man who looked as if he knew how to enjoy life. His wife, also built on heavy lines, with a coarse, vulgar face, and always dressed in a plum-coloured silk much the worse for wear. The nephew, quite young, slender, with pale features, dark eyes, and fair and rather curly hair. As a rule, the couple remained seated throughout the afternoon. It was Gabriel who betted for his uncle, watching the horses in the paddock, picking up tips to right and left among the jockeys and stable lads, running backward and forward between the stance and the Paris Mutuel. Luck had favoured them that day, for 3 times Dugrival's neighbours saw the young man come back and hand him money. The 5th race was just finishing. Dugrival lit a cigar. At that moment, a gentleman in a tight-fitting brown suit, with a face ending in a peaked grey beard, came up to him and asked, in a confidential whisper, "Does this happen to belong to you, sir?" And he displayed a gold watch and chain. Dugrival gave a start. "Why, yes, it's mine. Look, here are my initials, N.G., Nicolas Dugrival." And he at once, with a movement of terror, clapped his hand to his jacket pocket. The note-case was still there. "Ah," he said, greatly relieved, "that's a piece of luck. But all the same, how on earth was it done? Do you know the scoundrel?" "Yes, we've got him locked up. Pray come with me, and we'll soon look into the matter." "Whom have I the honour?" "Monsieur Delangle, detective inspector. I have sent to let Monsieur Marquenne, the magistrate, know." Nicolas Dugrival went out with the inspector, and the 2 of them started for the commissary's office, some distance behind the grandstand. They were within 50 yards of it, when the inspector was accosted by a man who said to him, hurriedly, "The fellow with the watch has blabbed. We're on the tracks of a whole gang. Monsieur Marquenne wants you to wait for him at the Paris Mutuel, and to keep a look-out near the 4th booth." There was a crowd outside the betting booths, and Inspector Delangle muttered, "It's an absurd arrangement. Whom am I to look out for? That's just like Monsieur Marquenne." He pushed aside a group of people who were crowding too close upon him. "By Jove, one has to use one's elbows here, and keep a tight hold on one's purse. That's the way you got your watch pinched, Monsieur Dugrival." "I can't understand." "Oh, if you knew how those gentry go to work! One never guesses what they're up to next. One of them treads on your foot, another gives you a poke in the eye with his stick, and the third picks your pocket before you know where you are. I've been had that way myself." He stopped and then continued angrily, "But bother it, what's the use of hanging about here? What a mob! It's unbearable! Ah, there's Monsieur Marquenne making signs to us. One moment, please, and be sure and wait for me here." He shouldered his way through the crowd. Nicolas Dugrival followed him for a moment with his eyes. Once the inspector was out of sight, he stood a little to one side, to avoid being hustled. A few minutes passed. The 6th race was about to start, when Dugrival saw his wife and nephew looking for him. He explained to them that Inspector Delangle was arranging matters with the magistrate. "Have you your money still?" asked his wife. "Why, of course I have," he replied. "The inspector and I took good care, I assure you, not to let the crowd jostle us." He felt his jacket, gave a stifled cry, thrust his hand into his pocket, and began to stammer inarticulate syllables, while Madame Dugrival gasped in dismay. What is it? What's the matter?" "Stolen," he moaned. "The pocket-book, the 50 notes. It's not true," she screamed. "It's not true. Yes, the inspector, a common sharper. He's the man." She uttered absolute yells. "Thief! Thief! Stop, thief! My husband's been robbed! 50,000 francs! We are ruined! Thief! Thief!" In a moment they were surrounded by policemen and taken to the commissary's office. Dugrival went like a lamb, absolutely bewildered. His wife continued to shriek at the top of her voice, piling up explanations, railing against the inspector. "Have him looked for, have him found. A brown suit, a pointed beard. Oh, the villain, to think what he's robbed us of. 50,000 francs! Why, Dugrival, what are you doing?" With one bound, she flung herself upon her husband. Too late, he had pressed the barrel of a revolver against his temple. A shot rang out. Dugrival fell. He was dead. The reader cannot have forgotten the commotion made by the newspapers in connection with this case, nor how they jumped at the opportunity once more to accuse the police of carelessness and blundering. Was it conceivable that a pickpocket could play the part of an inspector like that in broad daylight and in a public place, and rob a respectable man with impunity? Nicolas Dugrival's widow kept the controversy alive, thanks to her jeremiads and to the interviews which she granted on every hand. A reporter had secured a snapshot of her in front of her husband's body, holding up her hand and swearing to revenge his death. Her nephew Gabriel was standing beside her, with hatred pictured in his face. He too, it appeared, in a few words uttered in a whisper, but in a tone of fierce determination, had taken an oath to pursue and catch the murderer. The accounts described the humble apartment which they occupied at the Batignolles, and as they had been robbed of all their means, a sporting paper opened a subscription on their behalf. As for the mysterious Delangle, he remained undiscovered. 2 men were arrested, but had to be released forthwith. The police took up a number of clues, which were at once abandoned. More than one name was mentioned, and lastly they accused Arsène Lupin, an action which provoked the famous burglar's celebrated cable, dispatched from New York 6 days after the incident. Protest indignantly against calumny invented by baffled police. Send my condolences to unhappy victims, instructing my bankers to remit them 50,000 francs. True enough, on the day after the publication of the cable, a stranger rang at Madame Dugrival's door and handed her an envelope. The envelope contained 50,000 franc notes. This theatrical stroke was not at all calculated to allay the universal comment. But an event soon occurred which provided any amount of additional excitement. 2 days later, the people living in the same house as Madame Dugrival and her nephew were awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning by horrible cries and shrill calls for help. They rushed to the flat. The porter succeeded in opening the door. By the light of a lantern carried by one of the neighbours, he found Gabriel stretched at full length in his bedroom, with his wrists and ankles bound, and a gag forced into his mouth, while in the next room Madame Dugrival lay with her life's blood ebbing away through a great gash in her breast. She whispered, "The money! I've been robbed! All the notes gone!" And she fainted away. What had happened? Gabriel said, and as soon as she was able to speak, Madame Dugrival completed her nephew's story, that he was startled from his sleep by finding himself attacked by 2 men, one of whom gagged him, while the other fastened him down. He was unable to see the men in the dark, but he heard the noise of the struggle between them and his aunt. It was a terrible struggle, Madame Dugrival declared. The ruffians, who obviously knew their way about, guided by some intuition, made straight for the little cupboard containing the money, and in spite of her resistance and outcries, laid hands upon the bundle of bank notes. As they left, one of them, whom she had bitten in the arm, stabbed her with a knife, whereupon the men had both fled. Which way? She was asked. Through the door of my bedroom, and afterward, I suppose, through the hall door. Impossible! The porter would have noticed them. For the whole mystery lay in this: how had the ruffians entered the house, and how did they manage to leave it? There was no outlet open to them. Was it one of the tenants? A careful inquiry proved the absurdity of such a supposition. What then? Chief Inspector Ganimard, who was placed in special charge of the case, confessed that he had never known anything more bewildering. "It's very like Lupin," he said, "and yet it's not Lupin. No, there's more in it than meets the eye, something very doubtful and suspicious. Besides, if it were Lupin, why should he take back the 50,000 francs which he sent? There's another question that puzzles me. What is the connection between the second robbery and the first, the one on the racecourse? The whole thing is incomprehensible, and I have a sort of feeling, which is very rare with me, that it is no use hunting. For my part, I give it up." The examining magistrate threw himself into the case with heart and soul. The reporters united their efforts with those of the police. A famous English sleuth hound crossed the Channel. A wealthy American, whose head had been turned by detective stories, offered a big reward to whosoever should supply the first information leading to the discovery of the truth. 6 weeks later, no one was any the wiser. The public adopted Ganimard's view, and the examining magistrate himself grew tired of struggling in a darkness which only became denser as time went on. And life continued as usual with Dugrival's widow. Nursed by her nephew, she soon recovered from her wound. In the mornings, Gabriel settled her in an easy-chair at the dining-room window, did the rooms and then went out marketing. He cooked their lunch without even accepting the proffered assistance of the porter's wife. Worried by the police investigations, and especially by the requests for interviews, the aunt and nephew refused to see anybody. Not even the portress, whose chatter disturbed and wearied Madame de Gudéval, was admitted. She fell back upon Gabriel, whom she accosted each time that he passed her room. "Take care, Monsieur Gabriel, you're both of you being spied upon. There are men watching you. Why, only last night my husband caught a fellow staring up at your windows." "Nonsense," said Gabriel. "It's all right. That's the police protecting us." One afternoon, at about 4 o'clock, there was a violent altercation between two costermongers at the bottom of the street. The porter's wife at once left her room to listen to the invectives which the adversaries were hurling at each other's heads. Her back was no sooner turned than a man, young, of medium height, and dressed in a grey suit of irreproachable cut, slipped into the house and ran up the staircase. When he came to the 3rd floor, he rang the bell. Receiving no answer, he rang again. At the 3rd summons, the door opened. "Madame Dugrival?" he asked, taking off his hat. "Madame Dugrival is still an invalid and unable to see any one," said Gabriel, who stood in the hall. "It's most important that I should speak to her." "I am her nephew, and perhaps I could take her a message." "Very well," said the man. "Please tell Madame Dugrival that an accident has supplied me with valuable information concerning the robbery from which she has suffered, and that I should like to go over the flat and ascertain certain particulars for myself. I am accustomed to this sort of inquiry, and my call is sure to be of use to her." Gabriel examined the visitor for a moment, reflected and said, "In that case, I suppose my aunt will consent. Pray come in." He opened the door of the dining-room and stepped back to allow the other to pass. The stranger walked to the threshold, but, at the moment when he was crossing it, Gabriel raised his arm and, with a swift movement, struck him with a dagger over the right shoulder. A burst of laughter rang through the room. "Ha, ha, ha! Got him!" cried Madame Dugrival, darting up from her chair. "Well done, Gabriel! But I say, you haven't killed the scoundrel, have you?" "I don't think so, aunt. It's a small blade, and I didn't strike him too hard." The man was staggering, with his hands stretched in front of him and his face deathly pale. "You fool!" sneered the widow. "So you've fallen into the trap, and a good job, too. We've been looking out for you a long time. Come, my fine fellow, down with you. You don't care about it, do you? But you can't help yourself, you see. That's right, one knee on the ground, before the missus. Now the other knee. How well we've been brought up. Crash, there we go on the floor. Lord, if my poor Dugrival could only see him like that. And now, Gabriel, to work." She went to her bedroom and opened one of the doors of a hanging wardrobe filled with dresses. Pulling these aside, she pushed open another door which formed the back of the wardrobe and led to a room in the next house. "Help me carry him, Gabriel, and you'll nurse him as well as you can, won't you? For the present, he's worth his weight in gold to us, the artist." The hours succeeded one another. Days passed. One morning, the wounded man regained a moment's consciousness. He raised his eyelids and looked around him. He was lying in a room larger than that in which he had been stabbed, a room sparsely furnished, with thick curtains hanging before the windows from top to bottom. There was light enough, however, to enable him to see young Gabriel Dugrival seated on a chair beside him and watching him. "Ah, it's you, youngster," he muttered. "I congratulate you, my lad. You have a sure and pretty touch with the dagger." And he fell asleep again. That day and the following days he woke up several times, and each time he saw the stripling's pale face, his thin lips and his dark eyes, with the hard look in them. "You frighten me," he said. "If you have sworn to do for me, don't stand on ceremony. But cheer up, for goodness' sake. The thought of death has always struck me as the most humorous thing in the world. Whereas with you, old chap, it simply becomes lugubrious. I prefer to go to sleep. Good night." Still, Gabriel, in obedience to Madame Dugrival's orders, continued to nurse him with the utmost care and attention. The patient was almost free from fever, and was beginning to take beef tea and milk. He gained a little strength and jested. "When will the convalescent be allowed his first drive? Is the bath chair there? Why, cheer up, stupid. You look like a weeping willow contemplating a crime. Come, just one little smile for Daddy." One day, on waking, he had a very unpleasant feeling of constraint. After a few efforts, he perceived that, during his sleep, His legs, chest, and arms had been fastened to the bedstead with thin wire strands that cut into his flesh at the least movements. "Ah," he said to his keeper, "this time it's the great performance. The chicken's going to be bled. Are you operating, Angel Gabriel? If so, see that your razor's nice and clean, old chap. The antiseptic treatment, if you please." But he was interrupted by the sound of a key grating in the lock. The door opposite opened, and Madame Dugrival appeared. She approached slowly, took a chair, and, producing a revolver from her pocket, cocked it and laid it on the table by the bedside. "Brrr," said the prisoner, "we might be at the ambigu. Fourth act, the traitor's doom, and the fair sex to do the deed. The hand of the Graces. What an honour! Madame Dugrival, I rely on you not to disfigure me." "Hold your tongue, Lupin." "Ah, so you know. By Jove, how clever we are." "Hold your tongue, Lupin." There was a solemn note in her voice that impressed the captive and compelled him to silence. He watched his two jailers in turns. The bloated features and red complexion of Madame Dugrival formed a striking contrast with her nephew's refined face. But they both wore the same air of implacable resolve. The widow leaned forward and said, "Are you prepared to answer my questions?" "Why not?" "Then listen to me. How did you know that Dugrival carried all his money in his pocket?" "Servants' gossip." "A young manservant whom we had in our employ, was that it?" "Yes." "And did you steal Dugrival's watch in order to give it back to him and inspire him with confidence?" "Yes." She suppressed a movement of fury. "You fool! You fool! What, you rob my man, you drive him to kill himself, and instead of making tracks to the uttermost ends of the earth and hiding yourself, you go on playing Lupin in the heart of Paris. Did you forget that I swore on my dead husband's head to find his murderer?" "That's what staggers me," said Lupin. "How did you come to suspect me?" "How? Why, you gave yourself away." "I did?" "Of course, the 50,000 francs." "Well, what about it? A present?" "Yes, a present which you gave cabled instructions to have sent to me, so as to make believe that you were in America on the day of the races. A present, indeed! What humbug! The fact is, you didn't like to think of the poor fellow whom you had murdered. So you restored the money to the widow, publicly, of course, because you love playing to the gallery and ranting and posing, like the mountebank that you are. That was all very nicely thought out. Only, my fine fellow, you ought not to have sent me the self-same notes that were stolen from Dugrival. Yes, you silly fool, the self-same notes and no others. We knew the numbers, Dugrival and I did, and you were stupid enough to send the bundle to me. Now, do you understand your folly?" Lupin began to laugh. "It was a pretty blunder, I confess. I'm not responsible. I gave different orders. But all the same, I can't blame any one except myself." "Ah, so you admit it. You signed your theft and you signed your ruin at the same time. There was nothing left to be done but to find you." "Find you? No, better than that. Sensible people don't find Lupin. They make him come to them. That was a masterly notion. It belongs to my young nephew, who loathes you as much as I do, if possible, and who knows you thoroughly, through reading all the books that have been written about you. He knows your prying nature, your need to be always plotting, your mania for hunting in the dark and unravelling what others have failed to unravel. He also knows that sort of sham kindness of yours, the drivelling sentimentality that makes you shed crocodile tears over the people you victimize. And he planned the whole farce. He invented the story of the 2 burglars, the second theft of 50,000 francs. Oh, I swear to you before heaven that the stab which I gave myself with my own hands never hurt me. And I swear to you before heaven that we spent a glorious time waiting for you, the boy and I, peeping out at your confederates who prowled under our windows, taking their bearings. And there was no mistake about it. You were bound to come. Seeing that you had restored the widow Dugrival's 50,000 francs, it was out of the question that you should allow the widow Dugrival to be robbed of her 50,000 francs. You were bound to come, attracted by the scent of the mystery. You were bound to come for swagger, out of vanity. And you come." The widow gave a strident laugh. "Well played, wasn't it? The Lupin of Lupins, the master of masters, inaccessible and invisible, caught in a trap by a woman and a boy. Here he is in flesh and bone. Here he is with hands and feet tied, no more dangerous than a sparrow. Here he is. Here he is." She shook with joy and began to pace the room, throwing sidelong glances at the bed like a wild beast that does not for a moment take its eyes from its victim. And never had Lupin beheld greater hatred and savagery in any human being. "Enough of this prattle," she said. Suddenly restraining herself, she stalked back to him, and in a quite different tone, in a hollow voice, laying stress on every syllable: "Thanks to the papers in your pocket, Lupin, I have made good use of the last 12 days. I know all your affairs, all your schemes, all your assumed names, all the organization of your band, all the lodgings which you possess in Paris and elsewhere. I have even visited one of them, the most secret, the one where you hide your papers, your ledgers and the whole story of your financial operations. The result of my investigations is very satisfactory. Here are 4 cheques, taken from 4 cheque-books and corresponding with 4 accounts which you keep at 4 different banks under 4 different names. I have filled in each of them for 10,000 francs. A larger figure would have been too risky. And now, sign." End of chapter 4, part 1. Chapter 4, part 2 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 4, The Infernal Trap. "By Jove," said Lupin sarcastically, "this is blackmail, my worthy Madame Dugrival. That takes your breath away, what?" "It takes my breath away, as you say. And you find an adversary who is a match for you." "The adversary is far beyond me. So the trap, let us call it infernal, the infernal trap into which I have fallen was laid not merely by a widow thirsting for revenge, but also by a first-rate business-woman anxious to increase her capital." "Just so." "My congratulations. And while I think of it, used Monsieur Dugrival perhaps to—" "You have hit it, Lupin. After all, why conceal the fact? It will relieve your conscience. Yes, Lupin, Dugrival used to work on the same lines as yourself. Oh, not on the same scale. We were modest people, a louis here, a louis there, a purse or two which we trained Gabriel to pick up at the races, and in this way we had made our little pile, just enough to buy a small place in the country." "I prefer it that way," said Lupin. "That's all right. I'm only telling you so that you may know that I am not a beginner and that you have nothing to hope for. A rescue? No. The room in which we now are communicates with my bedroom. It has a private outlet of which nobody knows. It was Dugrival's special apartment. He used to see his friends here. He kept his implements and tools here, his disguises, his telephone even, as you perceive. So there's no hope, you see. Your accomplices have given up looking for you here. I have sent them off on another track. Your goose is cooked. Do you begin to realize the position?" "Yes." "Then sign the cheques." "And when I have signed them, shall I be free?" "I must cash them first." "And after that?" "After that, on my soul, as I hope to be saved, you will be free." "I don't trust you." "Have you any choice?" "That's true. Hand me the cheques." She unfastened Lupin's right hand, gave him a pen and said, "Don't forget that the 4 cheques require 4 different signatures and that the handwriting has to be altered in each case." "Never fear." He signed the cheques. "Gabriel," said the widow, "it is 10 o'clock. If I am not back by 12, it will mean that this scoundrel has played me one of his tricks. At 12 o'clock, blow out his brains. I am leaving you the revolver with which your uncle shot himself. There are 5 bullets left out of the 6. That will be ample." She left the room, humming a tune as she went. Lupin mumbled, "I wouldn't give 2pence for my life." He shut his eyes for an instant and then suddenly said to Gabriel, "How much?" And when the other did not appear to understand, he grew irritated. "I mean what I say. How much? Answer me, can't you? We drive the same trade, you and I. I steal, thou stealest, we steal. So we ought to come to terms. That's what we are here for. Well, is it a bargain? Shall we clear out together? I will give you a post in my gang, an easy, well-paid post. How much do you want for yourself? 10,000? 20,000? Fix your own price. Don't be shy. There's plenty to be had for the asking." An angry shiver passed through his frame as he saw the impassive face of his keeper. "Oh, the beggar won't even answer. Why, you can't have been so fond of old Dugrival as all that. Listen to me. If you consent to release me—" But he interrupted himself. The young man's eyes wore the cruel expression which he knew so well. What was the use of trying to move him? "Hang it all!" he snarled. "I'm not going to croak here like a dog. Oh, if I could only—" Stiffening all his muscles, he tried to burst his bonds, making a violent effort that drew a cry of pain from him, and he fell back upon his bed exhausted. "Well, well," he muttered after a moment. "It's as the widow said, my goose is cooked. Nothing to be done. De profundis, Lupin." A quarter of an hour passed. Half an hour. Gabriel, moving closer to Lupin, saw that his eyes were shut and that his breath came evenly, like that of a man sleeping. But Lupin said: "Don't imagine that I'm asleep, youngster. No, people don't sleep at a moment like this. Only I am consoling myself. Needs must, eh? And then I am thinking of what is to come after. Exactly. I have a little theory of my own about that. You wouldn't think it, to look at me, but I believe in metempsychosis, in the transmigration of souls. It would take too long to explain, however. I say, boy, suppose we shook hands before we part? You won't? Then good-bye. Good health and a long life to you, Gabriel." He closed his eyelids and did not stir again before Madame Dugrival's return. The widow entered with a lively step, at a few minutes before 12. She seemed greatly excited. "I have the money," she said to her nephew. "Run away. I'll join you in the motor down below. But I don't want your help to finish him off. I can do that alone. Still, if you feel like seeing the sort of a face a rogue can pull, pass me the weapon." Gabriel handed her the revolver, and the widow continued: "Have you burnt our papers?" "Yes." "Then to work, and as soon as he's done for, be off. The shots may bring the neighbours. They must find both the flats empty." She went up to the bed. "Are you ready, Lupin?" "Ready's not the word. I'm burning with impatience." "Have you any request to make of me?" "None." "Then—" "One word, though." "What is it?" "If I meet Dugrival in the next world, what message am I to give him from you?" She shrugged her shoulders and put the barrel of the revolver to Lupin's temple. "That's it," he said. "And be sure your hand doesn't shake, my dear lady. It won't hurt you, I swear. Are you ready? At the word of command, eh? 1, 2, 3. The widow pulled the trigger. A shot rang out. "Is this death?" said Lupin. "That's funny. I should have thought it was something much more different from life." There was a second shot. Gabriel snatched the weapon from his aunt's hands and examined it. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "The bullets have been removed. There are only the percussion caps left." His aunt and he stood motionless, for a moment, and confused. "Impossible!" she blurted out. "Who could have done it? An inspector? The examining magistrate?" She stopped, and in a low voice: "Hark! I hear a noise." They listened, and the widow went into the hall. She returned furious, exasperated by her failure and by the scare which she had received. "There's nobody there. It must have been the neighbours going out. We have plenty of time. Ah, Lupin, you were beginning to make merry. The knife, Gabriel." "It's in my room." "Go and fetch it." Gabriel hurried away. The widow stamped with rage. "I've sworn to do it. You've got to suffer, my fine fellow. I swore to Dugrival that I would do it, and I have repeated my oath every morning and evening since. I have taken it on my knees, yes, on my knees, before Heaven that listens to me. It's my duty and my right to revenge my dead husband. By the way, Lupin, you don't look quite as merry as you did. Lord, one would almost think you were afraid." "He's afraid! He's afraid! I can see it in his eyes. Come along, Gabriel, my boy. Look at his eyes. Look at his lips. He's trembling. Give me the knife so that I may dig it into his heart while he's shivering. Oh, you coward! Quick, quick, Gabriel, the knife." "I can't find it anywhere," said the young man, running back in dismay. "It has gone from my room. I can't make it out." "Never mind," cried the widow Dugrival, half demented. "All the better. I will do the business myself." She seized Lupin by the throat, clutched him with her 10 fingers, digging her nails into his flesh, and began to squeeze with all her might. Lupin uttered a hoarse rattle and gave himself up for lost. Suddenly there was a crash at the window. One of the panes was smashed to pieces. "Oh, what's that? What is it?" stammered the widow, drawing herself erect in alarm. Gabrielle, who had turned even paler than usual, murmured: "I don't know. I can't think." "Who can have done it?" said the widow. She dared not move, waiting for what would come next. And one thing above all terrified her, the fact that there was no missile on the floor around them, although the pane of glass, as was clearly visible, had given way before the crash of a heavy and fairly large object, a stone probably. After a while she looked under the bed, under the chest of drawers. "Nothing," she said. "No," said her nephew, who was also looking. And resuming her seat, she said: "I feel frightened. My arms fail me. You finish him off." Gabrielle confessed: "I'm frightened also." Still, she stammered, "it's got to be done. I swore it." Making one last effort, she returned to Lupin and grasped his neck with her stiff fingers. But Lupin, who was watching her pallid face, received a very clear sensation that she would not have the courage to kill him. To her he was becoming something sacred, vulnerable. A mysterious power was protecting him against every attack, a power which had already saved him 3 times by inexplicable means, and which would find other means to protect him against the wiles of death. She said to him in a hoarse voice: "Oh, you must be laughing at me." "Not at all, upon my word. I should feel frightened myself in your place." "Nonsense, you scum of the earth! You imagine that you will be rescued, that your friends are waiting outside. It's out of the question, my fine fellow." "I know. It's not they defending me. Nobody's defending me." "Well, then?" "Well, all the same, there's something strange at the bottom of it, something fantastic and miraculous that makes your flesh creep, my fine lady." "You villain! You'll be laughing on the other side of your mouth before long." "I doubt it." "You wait and see." She reflected once more and said to her nephew: "What would you do?" "Fasten his arm again and let's be off," he replied. A hideous suggestion. It meant condemning Lupin to the most horrible of all deaths, death by starvation. "No," said the widow, "he might still find a means of escape. I know something better than that." She took down the receiver of the telephone, waited and asked: "Number 82248, please." And after a second or two: "Hello, is that the Criminal Investigation Department? Is Chief Inspector Ganimard there?" "In 20 minutes, you say? Oh, I'm sorry. However, when he comes, give him this message from Madame Dugrival. Yes, Madame Nicolas Dugrival. Ask him to come to my flat. Tell him to open the looking-glass door of my wardrobe. And when he has done so, he will see that the wardrobe hides an outlet which makes my bedroom communicate with 2 other rooms. In one of these, he will find a man bound hand and foot. It is the thief, Dugrival's murderer. You don't believe me? Tell M. Ganimard. He'll believe me right enough. Oh, I was almost forgetting to give you the man's name. Arsène Lupin." And without another word, she replaced the receiver. "There, Lupin, that's done. After all, I would just as soon have my revenge this way. How I shall hold my sides when I read the reports of the Lupin trial. Are you coming, Gabrielle?" "Yes, aunt." "Good-bye, Lupin. You and I shan't see each other again, I expect, for we are going abroad. But I promise to send you some sweets while you're in prison." "Chocolates, mother. We'll eat them together." "Good-bye. Au revoir." The widow went out with her nephew, leaving Lupin fastened down to the bed. He at once moved his free arm and tried to release himself, but he realized at the first attempt that he would never have the strength to break the wire strands that bound him. Exhausted with fever and pain, what could he do in the 20 minutes or so that were left to him before Ganimard's arrival? Nor did he count upon his friends. True, he had been thrice saved from death, but this was evidently due to an astounding series of accidents and not to any interference on the part of his allies. Otherwise they would not have contented themselves with these extraordinary manifestations, but would have rescued him for good and all. No, he must abandon all hope. Ganimard was coming. Ganimard would find him there. It was inevitable. There was no getting away from the fact. And the prospect of what was coming irritated him singularly. He already heard his old enemy's gibes ringing in his ears. He foresaw the roars of laughter with which the incredible news would be greeted on the morrow. To be arrested in action, so to speak, on the battlefield, by an imposing detachment of adversaries was one thing, but to be arrested, or rather picked up, scraped up, gathered up, in such condition, was really too silly. And Lupin, who had so often scoffed at others, felt all the ridicule that was falling to his share in this ending of the Dugrival business, all the pathos of allowing himself to be caught in the widow's infernal trap, and finally of being served up to the police like a dish of game, roasted to a turn and nicely seasoned. "Blow the widow!" he growled. "I had rather she had cut my throat and done with it." He pricked up his ears. Someone was moving in the next room. Ganimard. No. Great as his eagerness would be, he could not be there yet. Besides, Ganimard would not have acted like that, would not have opened the door as gently as that other person was doing. What other person? Lupin remembered the 3 miraculous interventions to which he owed his life. Was it possible that there was really somebody who had protected him against the widow, and that somebody was now attempting to rescue him? But if so, who? Unseen by Lupin, the stranger stooped behind the bed. Lupin heard the sound of the pliers attacking the wire strands and releasing him little by little. First his chest was freed, then his arms, then his legs, and a voice said to him, "You must get up and dress." Feeling very weak, he half raised himself in bed at the moment when the stranger rose from her stooping posture. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Who are you?" And a great surprise overcame him. By his side stood a woman dressed in black, with a lace shawl over her head, covering part of her face. And the woman, as far as he could judge, was young and of a graceful and slender stature. "Who are you?" he repeated. "You must come now," said the woman. "There's no time to lose." "Can I?" asked Lupin, making a desperate effort. "I doubt if I have the strength." "Drink this." She poured some milk into a cup, and as she handed it to him, her lace opened, leaving the face uncovered. "You!" he stammered. "It's you! It's you who... It was you who were..." He stared in amazement at this woman whose features presented so striking a resemblance to Gabrielle's, whose delicate, regular face had the same pallor, whose mouth wore the same hard and forbidding expression. No sister could have borne so great a likeness to her brother. There was not a doubt possible. It was the identical person. And without believing for a moment that Gabriel had concealed himself in a woman's clothes, Lupin, on the contrary, received the distinct impression that it was a woman standing beside him, and that the stripling who had pursued him with his hatred and struck him with the dagger was in very deed a woman. In order to follow their trade with greater ease, the Dugrival pair had accustomed her to disguise herself as a boy. You, he repeated. Who would have suspected? She emptied the contents of a phial into the cup. "Drink this cordial," she said. He hesitated, thinking of poison. She added, "It was I who saved you." Of course," he said. "It was you who removed the bullets from the revolver." "Yes." "And you who hid the knife." "Here it is in my pocket." "And you who smashed the window pane while your aunt was throttling me." "Yes, it was I, with the paperweight on the table. I threw it into the street." "But why? Why?" he asked, in utter amazement. "Drink the cordial." "Didn't you want me to die? But then why did you stab me to begin with?" "Drink the cordial." He emptied the cup at a draught, without quite knowing the reason of his sudden confidence. "Dress yourself, quickly," she commanded, retiring to the window. He obeyed, and she came back to him, for he had dropped into a chair, exhausted. "We must go now. We must. We have only just time. Collect your strength." She bent forward a little, so that he might lean on her shoulder, and turned toward the door and the staircase. And Lupin walked as one walks in a dream, one of those queer dreams in which the most inconsequent things occur, a dream that was the happy sequel of the terrible nightmare in which he had lived for the past fortnight. A thought struck him, however. He began to laugh. Poor Ganimard! Upon my word, the fellow has no luck. I would give twopence to see him coming to arrest me. After descending the staircase with the aid of his companion, who supported him with incredible vigour, he found himself in the street, opposite a motor car into which she helped him to mount. "Right away," she said to the driver. Lupin, dazed by the open air and the speed at which they were travelling, hardly took stock of the drive and of the incidents on the road. He recovered all his consciousness when he found himself at home in one of the flats which he occupied, looked after by his servant, to whom the girl gave a few rapid instructions. "You can go," he said to the man. But when the girl turned to go as well, he held her back by a fold of her dress. No, you must first explain. Why did you save me? Did you return unknown to your aunt? But why did you save me? Was it from pity?" She did not answer. With her figure drawn up and her head flung back a little, she retained her hard and impenetrable air. Nevertheless, he thought he noticed that the lines of her mouth showed not so much cruelty as bitterness. Her eyes, her beautiful dark eyes, revealed melancholy. And Lupin, without as yet understanding, received a vague intuition of what was passing within her. He seized her hand. She pushed him away with a start of revolt in which he felt hatred, almost repulsion. And when he insisted, she cried: "Let me be, will you? Let me be! Can't you see that I detest you?" They looked at each other for a moment, Lupin disconcerted, she quivering and full of uneasiness, her pale face all flushed with unwonted colour. He said to her gently: "If you detested me, you should have let me die. It was simple enough. Why didn't you?" "Why? Why? How do I know?" Her face contracted. With a sudden movement, she hid it in her two hands, and he saw tears trickle between her fingers. Greatly touched, he thought of addressing her in fond words, such as one would use to a little girl whom one wished to console, and of giving her good advice, and saving her in his turn, and snatching her from the bad life which he was leading, perhaps against her better nature. But such words would have sounded ridiculous, coming from his lips, and he did not know what to say, now that he understood the whole story, and was able to picture the young woman sitting beside his sick-bed, nursing the man whom she had wounded, admiring his pluck and gaiety, becoming attached to him, falling in love with him, and thrice over, probably in spite of herself, under a sort of instinctive impulse, amid fits of spite and rage, saving him from death. And all this was so strange, so unforeseen. Lupin was so much unmanned by his astonishment that, this time, he did not try to retain her when she made for the door, backward, without taking her eyes from him. She lowered her head, smiled for an instant, and disappeared. He rang the bell quickly. "Follow that woman," he said to his man. "Or, no, stay where you are. After all, it is better so." He sat brooding for a while, possessed by the girl's image. Then he revolved in his mind all that curious, stirring and tragic adventure in which he had been so very near succumbing, and taking a hand-glass from the table, he gazed for a long time, and with a certain self-complacency at his features, which illness and pain had not succeeded in impairing to any great extent. "Good looks count for something, after all," he muttered. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5, Part 1 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 5, The Red Silk Scarf. On leaving his house one morning, at his usual early hour for going to the law courts, Chief Inspector Ganimard noticed the curious behaviour of an individual who was walking along the Rue Pergolèse in front of him. Shabbily dressed and wearing a straw hat, though the day was the 1st of December, the man stooped at every 30 or 40 yards to fasten his bootlace, or pick up his stick, or for some other reason. And each time he took a little piece of orange peel from his pocket and laid it stealthily on the curb of the pavement. It was probably a mere display of eccentricity, a childish amusement to which no one else would have paid attention. But Ganimard was one of those shrewd observers who are indifferent to nothing that strikes their eyes, and who are never satisfied until they know the secret cause of things. He therefore began to follow the man. Now, at the moment when the fellow was turning to the right, into the Avenue de la Grande Armée, the inspector caught him exchanging signals with a boy of 12 or 13, who was walking along the houses on the left-hand side. 20 yards further, the man stooped and turned up the bottom of his trouser legs. A bit of orange peel marked the place. At the same moment, the boy stopped and, with a piece of chalk, drew a white cross, surrounded by a circle, on the wall of the house next to him. The two continued on their way. A minute later, a fresh halt. The strange individual picked up a pin and dropped a piece of orange peel, and the boy at once made a second cross on the wall, and again drew a white circle round it. "By Jove!" thought the chief inspector, with a grunt of satisfaction. "This is rather promising. What on earth can those two merchants be plotting?" The two merchants went down the Avenue Friedland and the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, but nothing occurred that was worthy of special mention. The double performance was repeated at almost regular intervals, and, so to speak, mechanically. Nevertheless, it was obvious, on the one hand, that the man with the orange peel did not do his part of the business until after he had picked out with a glance the house that was to be marked, and, on the other hand, that the boy did not mark that particular house until after he had observed his companion's signal. It was certain, therefore, that there was an agreement between the two, and the proceedings presented no small interest in the chief inspector's eyes. At the Place Beauvau the man hesitated. Then, apparently making up his mind, he twice turned up and twice turned down the bottom of his trousers legs. Hereupon the boy sat down on the curb, opposite the sentry who was mounting guard outside the Ministry of the Interior, and marked the flagstone with 2 little crosses contained within 2 circles. The same ceremony was gone through a little farther on, when they reached the Élysée. Only on the pavement where the President's sentry was marching up and down, there were 3 signs instead of 2. "Hang it all," muttered Ganimard, pale with excitement and thinking, in spite of himself, of his inveterate enemy Lupin, whose name came to his mind whenever a mysterious circumstance presented itself. "Hang it all, what does it mean?" He was nearly collaring and questioning the 2 merchants, but he was too clever to commit so gross a blunder. The man with the orange peel had now lit a cigarette, and the boy, also placing a cigarette end between his lips, had gone up to him, apparently with the object of asking for a light. They exchanged a few words. Quick as thought, the boy handed his companion an object which looked, at least so the inspector believed, like a revolver. They both bent over this object, and the man, standing with his face to the wall, put his hand 6 times in his pocket and made a movement as though he were loading a weapon. As soon as this was done, they walked briskly to the Rue de Surène, and the inspector, who followed them as closely as he was able to do without attracting their attention, saw them enter the gateway of an old house of which all the shutters were closed, with the exception of those on the 3rd or top floor. He hurried in after them. At the end of the carriage entrance he saw a large courtyard, with a house painter's sign at the back and a staircase on the left. He went up the stairs and, as soon as he reached the 1st floor, ran still faster, because he heard, right up at the top, a din as of a free fight. When he came to the last landing, he found the door open. He entered, listened for a second, caught the sound of a struggle, rushed to the room from which the sound appeared to proceed, and remained standing on the threshold, very much out of breath and greatly surprised to see the man of the orange peel and the boy banging the floor with chairs. At that moment, a 3rd person walked out of an adjoining room. It was a young man of 28 or 30, wearing a pair of short whiskers in addition to his moustache, spectacles, and a smoking jacket with an astrakhan collar, and looking like a foreigner, a Russian. "Good morning, Ganimard," he said, and turning to the 2 companions, "Thank you, my friends, and all my congratulations on the successful result. Here's the reward I promised you." He gave them a 100-franc note, pushed them outside, and shut both doors. "I'm sorry, old chap," he said to Ganimard. "I wanted to talk to you badly." He offered him his hat, and, seeing that the inspector remained flabbergasted and that his face was still distorted with anger, he exclaimed: "Why, you don't seem to understand. And yet it's clear enough. I wanted to see you particularly, so what could I do?" And pretending to reply to an objection, "No, old chap," he continued, "you're quite wrong. If I had written or telephoned, you would not have come, or else you would have come with a regiment. Now, I wanted to see you all alone, and I thought the best thing was to send those 2 decent fellows to meet you, with orders to scatter bits of orange peel and draw crosses and circles. In short, to mark out your road to this place. Why, you look quite bewildered. What is it? Perhaps you don't recognize me. Lupin! Arsène Lupin! Ransack your memory. Doesn't the name remind you of anything?" "You dirty scoundrel!" Ganimard snarled between his teeth. Lupin seemed greatly distressed, and, in an affectionate voice: "Are you vexed? Yes, I can see it in your eyes. The Dugrival business, I suppose. I ought to have waited for you to come and take me in charge. There now, the thought never occurred to me. I promise you next time." "You scum of the earth!" growled Ganimard. "And I thinking I was giving you a treat! Upon my word, I did. I said to myself, that dear old Ganimard, we haven't met for an age. He'll simply rush at me when he sees me." Ganimard, who had not yet stirred a limb, seemed to be waking from his stupor. He looked around him, looked at Lupin, visibly asked himself whether he would not do well to rush at him in reality, and then, controlling himself, took hold of a chair and settled himself in it, as though he had suddenly made up his mind to listen to his enemy. "Speak," he said, "and don't waste my time with any nonsense. I'm in a hurry." "That's it," said Lupin. "Let's talk. You can't imagine a quieter place than this. It's an old manor house, which once stood in the open country, and it belongs to the Duc de Rochelaure. The Duke, who has never lived in it, lets this floor to me, and the outhouses to a painter and decorator. I always keep up a few establishments of this kind. It's a sound, practical plan. Here, in spite of my looking like a Russian nobleman, I'm M. d'Aubreuil, an ex-cabinet minister. You understand, I had to select a rather overstocked profession so as not to attract attention." "Do you think I care a hang about all this?" said Ganimard, interrupting him. "Quite right. I'm wasting words, and you're in a hurry. Forgive me. I shan't be long now. 5 minutes, that's all. I'll start at once. Have a cigar? No? Very well. No more will I." He sat down also, drummed his fingers on the table while thinking, and began in this fashion. "On the 17th of October, 1599, on a warm and sunny autumn day. Do you follow me? But now that I come to think of it, is it really necessary to go back to the reign of Henry IV and tell you all about the building of the Pont Neuf? No, I don't suppose you are very well up in French history, and I should only end by muddling you. Suffice it, then, for you to know that last night, at 1 o'clock in the morning, a boatman passing under the last arch of the Pont Neuf aforesaid, along the left bank of the river, heard something drop into the front part of his barge. The thing had been flung from the bridge, and its evident destination was the bottom of the Seine. The bargee's dog rushed forward, barking, and when the man reached the end of his craft, he saw the animal worrying a piece of newspaper that had served to wrap up a number of objects. He took from the dog such of the contents as had not fallen into the water, went to his cabin and examined them carefully. The result struck him as interesting, and as the man is connected with one of my friends, he sent to let me know. This morning I was waked up and placed in possession of the facts and of the objects which the man had collected. Here they are." He pointed to them, spread out on a table. There were, first of all, the torn pieces of a newspaper. Next came a large cut-glass inkstand, with a long piece of string fastened to the lid. There was a bit of broken glass and a sort of flexible cardboard, reduced to shreds. Lastly, there was a piece of bright scarlet silk, ending in a tassel of the same material and colour. "You see our exhibits, friend of my youth," said Lupin. "No doubt the problem would be more easily solved if we had the other objects which went overboard owing to the stupidity of the dog. But it seems to me, all the same, that we ought to be able to manage with a little reflection and intelligence. And those are just your great qualities. How does the business strike you?" Ganimard did not move a muscle. He was willing to stand Lupin's chaff, but his dignity commanded him not to speak a single word in answer, nor even to give it a nod or shake of the head that might have been taken to express approval or criticism. "I see that we are entirely of one mind," continued Lupin, without appearing to remark the chief inspector's silence. "And I can sum up the matter briefly, as told us by these exhibits. Yesterday evening, between 9 and 12 o'clock, a showily dressed young woman was wounded with a knife, and then caught round the throat and choked to death by a well-dressed gentleman, wearing a single eyeglass and interested in racing, with whom the aforesaid showily dressed young lady had been eating 3 meringues and a coffee éclair." Lupin lit a cigarette and, taking Ganimard by the sleeve: "Aha, that's up against you, Chief Inspector. You thought that in the domain of police deductions such feats as those were prohibited to outsiders. Wrong, sir. Lupin juggles with inferences and deductions for all the world like a detective in a novel. My proofs are dazzling and absolutely simple." And pointing to the objects one by one, as he demonstrated his statement, he resumed: "I said after 9 o'clock yesterday evening. This scrap of newspaper bears yesterday's date, with the words 'Evening Edition.' Also, you will see here, pasted to the paper, a bit of one of those yellow wrappers in which the subscribers' copies are sent out. These copies are always delivered by the 9 o'clock post. Therefore, it was after 9 o'clock. I said a well-dressed man. Please observe that this tiny piece of glass has the round hole of a single eyeglass at one of the edges, and that the single eyeglass is an essentially aristocratic article of wear. This well-dressed man walked into a pastry-cook's shop. Here is the very thin cardboard, shaped like a box, and still showing a little of the cream of the meringues and éclairs which were packed in it in the usual way. Having got his parcel, the gentleman with the eyeglass joined a young person whose eccentricity in the matter of dress is pretty clearly indicated by this bright red silk scarf. Having joined her, for some reason as yet unknown, he first stabbed her with a knife and then strangled her with the help of this same scarf. Take your magnifying glass, Chief Inspector, and you will see, on the silk, stains of a darker red which are, here, the marks of a knife wiped on the scarf, and there the marks of a hand, covered with blood, clutching the material. Having committed the murder, his next business is to leave no trace behind him. So he takes from his pocket, first, the newspaper to which he subscribes, a racing paper, as you will see by glancing at the contents of this scrap, and you will have no difficulty in discovering the title, and secondly, a cord, which on inspection turns out to be a length of whipcord. These two details prove, do they not, that our man is interested in racing and that he himself rides. Next, he picks up the fragments of his eyeglass, the cord of which has been broken in the struggle. He takes a pair of scissors, observe the hacking of the scissors, and cuts off the stained part of the scarf, leaving the other end, no doubt, in his victim's clenched hands. He makes a ball of the confectioner's cardboard box. He also puts in certain things that would have betrayed him, such as the knife, which must have slipped into the Seine. He wraps everything in the newspaper, ties it with the cord, and fastens this cut-glass inkstand to it, as a make-weight. Then he makes himself scarce. A little later, the parcel falls into the waterman's barge. And there you are. Oof, it's hot work. What do you say to the story? He looked at Ganimard to see what impression his speech had produced on the inspector. Ganimard did not depart from his attitude of silence. Lupin began to laugh. As a matter of fact, you're annoyed and surprised. But you're suspicious as well. Why should that confounded Lupin hand the business over to me, say you, instead of keeping it for himself, hunting down the murderer and rifling his pockets if there was a robbery? The question is quite logical, of course. But there is a but. I have no time, you see. I am full up with work at the present moment. A burglary in London, another at Lausanne, an exchange of children at Marseille, to say nothing of having to save a young girl who is at this moment shadowed by death. That's always the way. It never rains, but it pours. So I said to myself, suppose I handed the business over to my dear old Ganimard. Now that it is half solved for him, he is quite capable of succeeding. And what a service I shall be doing him! How magnificently he will be able to distinguish himself! No sooner said than done. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I sent the joker with the orange peel to meet you. You swallowed the bait, and you were here by 9, all on edge and eager for the fray. Lupin rose from his chair. He went over to the inspector and, with his eyes in Ganimard's, said, "That's all. You now know the whole story. Presently you will know the victim, some ballet dancer probably, some singer at a music hall. On the other hand, the chances are that the criminal lives near the Pont Neuf, most likely on the left bank. Lastly, here are all the exhibits. I make you a present of them. Set to work. I shall only keep this end of the scarf. If ever you want to piece the scarf together, bring me the other end, the one which the police will find round the victim's neck. Bring it me in 4 weeks from now to the day, that is to say, on the 29th of December, at 10 o'clock in the morning. You can be sure of finding me here. And don't be afraid. This is all perfectly serious, friend of my youth. I swear it is. No humbug, honour bright. You can go straight ahead. Oh, by the way, when you arrest the fellow with the eyeglass, be a bit careful. He's left-handed. Good-bye, old dear, and good luck to you." Lupin spun round on his heel, went to the door, opened it, and disappeared before Ganimard had even thought of taking a decision. The inspector rushed after him, but at once found that the handle of the door, by some trick of mechanism which he did not know, refused to turn. It took him 10 minutes to unscrew the lock, and 10 minutes more to unscrew the lock of the hall door. By the time that he had scrambled down the 3 flights of stairs, Ganimard had given up all hope of catching Arsène Lupin. Besides, he was not thinking of it. Lupin inspired him with a queer, complex feeling, made up of fear, hatred, involuntary admiration, and also the vague instinct that he, Ganimard, in spite of all his efforts, in spite of the persistency of his endeavours, would never get the better of this particular adversary. He pursued him from a sense of duty and pride, but with the continual dread of being taken in by that formidable hoaxer, and scouted and fooled in the face of a public that was always only too willing to laugh at the chief inspector's mishaps. This business of the red scarf in particular struck him as most suspicious. It was interesting, certainly, in more ways than one, but so very improbable. And Lupin's explanation, apparently so logical, would never stand the test of a severe examination. "No," said Ganimard, "this is all swank, a parcel of suppositions and guesswork based upon nothing at all. I'm not to be caught with chaff." When he reached the headquarters of the police, at 36 Quai des Orfèvres, he had quite made up his mind to treat the incident as though it had never happened. He went up to the Criminal Investigation Department. Here one of his fellow inspectors said: "Seen the chief?" "No." "He was asking for you just now." "Oh, was he?" "Yes, you had better go after him." "Where?" "To the Rue de Berne. There was a murder there last night." "Oh? Who's the victim?" "I don't know exactly. A music hall singer, I believe." Ganimard simply muttered: "By Jove!" Chapter 5.